Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here in Tijuana in Mexico. And I'm gonna have to apologize right up front. I have few talents as it is, and one of them is not speaking Spanish. So I'm gonna have to do what I do in English, and hopefully that will be okay. Let me take a moment while we're trying to get the slides up to explain what I'm going to speak about. Um, I was given a topic that talked the focus was on revision on a global scale around the world. And I'm certainly going to be able to give you some numbers, at least from the United States, where we have pretty good data looking at the issue of revisional surgery. But I took the word global to be a little different. And what I want to do is talk about how much we're learning or need to learn about bariatric surgery as we now get more and more into revisional work. So this will be maybe a little more philosophical than data-driven for this talk. Okay, thank you. So I thought I would talk about the perspective of someone who has been working in the area of revision now for a number of years, and what that really means to our specialty as a whole. Here are my disclosures. And I think we're going to touch on some key issues that we need to solve in order to reinvent our specialty for the future. That seems a little grandiose, but for a number of reasons in recent years, I've been very involved with working and helping struggling patients after previous bariatric surgery. And nothing haunts me more than a patient who comes to the office and says, I wish I had never had this procedure done. And I think we all need to take that as a challenge to try and reach out and help the patient and solve the problems. If you speak to patients who have had bariatric surgery, often years or even decades ago, they will often say things like, I had my bariatric surgery and it worked great for a few years, but now it doesn't work anymore. They say things like, I can eat anything I want, I can eat as much as I want, I can eat the same as my spouse who never had bariatric surgery, and I don't feel my surgery anymore when I eat. So I felt very passionately about this, and for a period of time, about 8 or 9 years ago, I actually opened my office adjacent to a gym that I owned, and I ran a gym and multiple behavioral management programs out of that facility. The concept was that we would bring in struggling postoperative patients and help them in a very comprehensive manner on site in the same facility. So I would often interview the patients about their weight regain struggles, and I would personally take the patients on a tour of the gym and talk to them about the behavioral changes that were necessary. And I would recommend a comprehensive treatment plan focusing on all the strategies that we could use to treat recurrent obesity. Food choices, I had a dietitian consultant coming in, I had an eating disorders psychologist, I had the gym, and what better, I said, you'd be working out right next to your surgeon. I'd be working out right in the same class with them. How more motivated could you be, right? So this is great. Patients would say, this is great, what a great facility. We appreciate the vision, the facilities that are available. I'm so glad you can provide everything that I need under one roof right here. And then they would say, but when are you going to do my revision? And I said, but we just talked about all this behavioral stuff. And they said, no, doctor, you don't understand. My surgery has changed. I don't feel it anymore. Something's different. It's a problem inside with my anatomy. It's not a problem necessarily with my behavior. So my surgery doesn't talk to me anymore. So with this talk, I'm hoping to use this type of experience, talking to many patients over the years, to talk about issues in our specialty that need attention and even solutions. And I'm going to touch on some unpleasant things, some things that might challenge your view of what we do as bariatric surgeons. And of course, I certainly hope no one shoots the messenger. This is meant to be a little bit of an introspective dive into these important things. So let's start with some of these basic problems, like in the US, where you have a lot of patients who are required to lose weight by their insurance company, or at least have documentation of their efforts, sometimes going on for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. So having patients have to treat their own obesity before surgery is like the lung cancer patient that can't get treatment until they stop their voluntary behavior, but then that also assumes that obesity is a voluntary condition, which of course it isn't. So refusing to treat a cancer patient until they can reduce their own tumor burden without chemotherapy, I mean, this is nonsense, right? And so we all know that cancer is a disease, however, and everyone sees this as nonsense, but in our field, in our obesity-focused disease treatment model, we're often required to do these things before we can treat the patient. So one of the very big underlying issues we have in the treatment of morbid obesity or severe obesity is looking at how it arises. What is the cause of the disease? Well, it's multifactorial, and that makes it hard because in every patient there may be different factors at play. There's a strong genetic component, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Sometimes it seems to be mostly a disease of eating behavior. Certainly trends in recent years identify it as a disease of metabolism. Is it a disease of hunger and appetite, or are those merely expressions of the disease? And it could be a disease of the gut and other neuroendocrine factors. But one thing that I think we all have to bear in mind as we do surgical procedures for this disease is that it almost certainly is not a disease of the capacity of the stomach for the vast majority of patients. But isn't it interesting that that's what we often manipulate surgically in order to attain a result? So over the last 5 to 6 decades, in the absence of much information and without a scientific model to guide their work, the pioneers of bariatric surgery developed their theories about what to do surgically, and then applied those interventions to patients who eagerly sought their care. The goal was, of course, to relieve human suffering, but the end result, in many ways, was very much human experimentation as surgeons carried out these surgical procedure plans on patients with the hope that these things would work. So metabolic and bariatric surgery began this way over the past 5 to 6 decades. This may seem problematic, but actually this is no different than the other available treatments for obesity. They're all based on theory that these interventions make a difference. Diet, exercise. Exercise is actually one of the least beneficial interventions for morbid obesity. There's very little evidence that it really works. Medications are newer on the market. Psychological treatments. Surgery is like all these things in being at least somewhat empiric in how it functions in the obesity situation. But there was one very critical difference between surgery to treat obesity and all these other things, which is in fact that it worked. And fortunately it worked because it developed a field, a specialty of surgery where we could actually try to make a difference in the lives of these patients. It was not our colleagues in healthcare who drove obesity surgery forward. It was actually patients talking to patients, family members of patients, seeking out treatment for this disease when medicine had very little to offer them other than these new surgery ideas. And as my mentor from Virginia said many years ago, Harvey Sugarman, doing a gastric bypass for obesity is a treatment like no other in medicine, as one surgical procedure can cure 4 or 5 of the patient's health problems. It truly is a remarkable thing that we do. So back in the day, many years ago now, we had the pioneering era of surgical intervention. So this is when surgeons were creating concepts and applying them to the care of their patients. Things like the GI bypass and other forms of extreme malabsorptive surgery were being done. Gastric bypass appeared on the horizon. Then we had surgeons thinking that was too dangerous and we should do purely restrictive operations like banding the stomach and gastroplasties of various types. And then we had the advent of the laparoscopic procedures. But the pioneering era of surgical experimentation actually has transitioned to the current era of very similar surgical experimentation. And I think we need to bear that in mind. We live in a different world today, and there's much less tolerance for innovation in terms of the potential risk-benefit equation. And of course, we do this motivated to help patients, but we still are learning as we roll forward these innovations, and it's a great responsibility to take very seriously, because we know we have a vulnerable patient population. From the very beginning, patients sought out treatment. They believe fads. They embrace ideas that they think could work, and that's a tremendous responsibility for us to make sure that we're really offering treatments that have benefit and benefit compared to risk. I love this Walter Pori's cartoon because it kind of symbolizes some of the early developments and even some of the developments today in bariatric surgery. The doctor's pointing to this crazy diagram and says, "No, of course not. Nobody's ever had this operation done. I designed it just for you." And that's sometimes what bariatric surgery seems like. But I think we have to ask the question, if all the data that we talk about is so overwhelmingly positive, if it's so clear that what we do benefits patients, then why isn't the debate settled? Why haven't we moved forward? Why don't our payers, particularly in the United States, embrace it rather than fight us over every case? And why don't our medical colleagues advocate for surgical treatment? Now, granted, some do, but many do not, and many do not believe that this is the right treatment for their patients. So all these entities, particularly in the United States, we are subject to what I call scrutiny. You know, we're scrutinized by every entity, and it wasn't too many years ago, back in about 2005, in the laparoscopic revolution in bariatric surgery, where bariatric surgery came very close to going away. The media attention was brutal over complications. The healthcare systems were starting to scrutinize outcomes in bariatric surgery. Insurance companies were threatening not to pay for it, and of course we have many lawyers waiting for our bad outcomes to try and earn their living. So the numbers still, however, in the US, and this is where I'm going to talk about numbers of procedures, are growing. These are some data from just a couple of years ago, looking at data 2015 in the United States, and draw your attention to the far right-hand side where we see the various procedures. The one I want to particularly draw to your attention here is the revision growth in the US. 13, now it's over 14% of all bariatric operations in the US are revisional procedures. and we're well over 200,000 cases, 228,000 in the most recent year. Yet this growth is completely explained by the growth in the US population. In fact, we have no greater penetration into the category of eligible patients than we did years ago. We still live at about the 1% level of penetration. And what that means is patients who theoretically would be candidates based on simple statistics like body mass index, patients who should be candidates but are actually coming forward and successfully having surgery. So this increase that we see in the total number of procedures is completely due to the growth in the US population. So now in 2017, we're actually over 30,000 revisional procedures in the United States. This is a tremendous increase in just a few years. This is one of the fastest growing categories of bariatric surgical procedures. So the fastest growing is the sleeve gastrectomy with a tremendous nearly quadrupling of procedures over a few years. But revisions are not far behind. This is the number in 2011, under 10,000, over 25,000 in 2015, and as I said, this number is now over 32,000 for the most recent year in the United States. So it is likely that most of these revisions are conversions from one procedure to another procedure, but they are certainly not all conversions from one procedure to another procedure. So here's the procedures that are suffering in terms of decreasing. The band, the gastric bypass, the BPD, all have decreased in terms of the numbers of procedures being done. This is another way to look at the number of revision procedures being done in the United States. So let me walk you through this. These bars on the bottom, starting in 1990, are the total estimated number of bariatric primary operations done in the US for each year. And right around here, right around the year 2000, we have this tremendous growth. And this was really the advent of laparoscopic bariatric surgery in the US. Now this red line is the current number of revisional procedures done in the US. So what you can see from this is that we're actually doing more revision procedures than we did any bariatric procedures prior to the year 1999. So revision, that's how much it's grown. It's bigger now than bariatric surgery was in the 90s by itself. So it kind of puts things into a little perspective. So here's a short list of all the various procedures that we've done as bariatric surgeons over the years. And one of the points that I really want to emphasize is how many of these operations are no longer around. So we had the GI bypasses, the various gastroplasties, the non-adjustable bands, the VBG operation, and the list kind of goes on and on. Clearly, we have a history as a specialty of starting off in directions procedurally that don't follow through with the benefits and acceptable risk that we want to see with the procedures. So this is a graph that's probably familiar to many people. This is the numbers of procedures offered of the different types, and you can see the sleeve growth over about 5 to 10 years, and then the gastric banding decreasing. It's decreased even further. Gastric bypass is now decreasing as well. So a lot of change in the procedures that we offer. Today's bariatric surgeon doesn't really look like the bariatric surgeon of 10 years ago in terms of what they do surgically to treat this disease. So are we still working to develop the best surgical strategy to treat obesity, or are we still uncertain as to what we should be doing to help these patients? And I think that it's important for us to at least recognize that this second way to phrase this, we're still uncertain as to the right treatment approach. Many of our medical colleagues feel this to be the case. And I've had many conversations with medical doctors where they look at me and they say, well, you don't even really know what operation to do. You know, you're telling me now the sleeve is a good choice. 5 years ago, you were telling me the bypass was the only thing to do. 5 years before that, you told me everybody should maybe think about having a lap band before they have anything else. Our medical colleagues are frustrated with us in part because they can't figure out what we're doing and what we believe in and what the data show. And I think we have to recognize that in order to understand where they come from and reach out to them. So the study of revisional interventions, or RBMI, is basically the study of recidivism in this disease. And I think the study of revision does a lot to point out the flaws in some of our thinking, as well as some of the challenges we face as bariatric surgery specialists. So one thing we're strongly based on is the idea that obesity is a chronic disease. Revision has brought that to the forefront probably more than anything else in bariatric surgery, because we see disease recurrence, and that's what we're often facing as far as treatment. And I have to wonder, you know, as a specialist who deals with revision, I have to wonder why our predecessors ever promised that a single operation could cure the patient's disease. Now we have to backtrack for that claim. We have to be explaining, frankly, that we were wrong. Now, I think I understand why the claim was made. I think I understand, you know, we were an unaccepted treatment concept in bariatric surgery, and we had to kind of put our best foot forward and maybe overpromise, but I think there's no question we've under-delivered in this area. Why would we have revision growing so quickly if patients just needed a single operation to cure their disease? So this is a particularly relevant example of how I think the world of revision is helping us clarify our specialty and get some really important take-homes that we have to now deal with and figure out how to handle. So in the United States, a couple of years ago, we did a public survey asking the public what they thought of bariatric surgery, and in particular, we were able to identify some of the subsets that were actually patients themselves, and we learned a lot of interesting things from the patients. Again, when in doubt, talk to the patients, I guess, is the take home. But many of them who were obese and even qualified for surgery didn't recognize that they did. They didn't even have that self-awareness to think they were candidates. Many knew someone who had weight loss surgery, and I see this all the time. It's interesting to me that patients don't really understand that Mrs. Smith down the street had that weight loss surgery, but they really don't know what the patient had done. They really don't know if it was a band or a sleeve or a bypass or whatever. All they know is that if they see that patient fail and regain weight over time, it gives the entire specialty a bad name, a bad rep out there. So we do have the problem that it's obvious when our patients fail and regain weight. When they gain all their weight back, it's very clear to their friends and family. And therefore, patients question the effectiveness out there on the street with people that they know and so forth. So it's critical that we address this problem of disease recurrence because it undermines our specialty. We have to have strategies to take care of these struggling patients. So the result of this and many other things that are happening out there with our patients is that we end up with a credibility problem, and isn't it therefore no wonder You know, we've had credibility problems since the beginning of our specialty. Our surgical colleagues didn't really think for many years that we were doing anything that was reasonable. Our non-surgical colleagues, but even with the public, we have to have plans B and C and D for these patients. We cannot fall into the trap that many insurance companies are trying to push us into, where you only get one procedure and that's it, because we know it violates the chronic disease model. So a revision-oriented bariatric surgeon clearly develops a deep understanding that a single procedure doesn't cure this chronic disease. I think we need to ask fundamental questions about the primary procedures. How were they done? How was the patient matched to the procedure? Did it make sense to match this patient with that procedure? What about the technical side of the procedure and how it was performed? What are the standards for performing those primary procedures? I think revision-oriented bariatric surgeons also have a fundamental strong belief in the need for long-term follow-up, because we at least theorize that patients who have that long-term follow-up will ultimately do better in the long term. And it frustrates us when we see patients come back years later with no care for those intervening years, and they're right back where they started from with their morbid obesity problem. I think revision surgeons also become hopefully less judgmental in their assessment of struggling postoperative patients. I think it's important that we not assume behavioral failure until we've actually looked at the previous operation. Now, I've talked to a lot of people who struggle after bariatric surgery, and I can tell you that after doing this for years, I can't tell if a staple line's intact or not by shaking someone's hand. I have to look anatomically. Yet how often do we judge someone when they walk into the office and we assume that their behavior has gotten off track, when we don't even know if the operation is intact? So my plea for all of us is that we exercise more compassion until we really understand the patient's anatomy and behavior, not just behavior. So, so I do think laparoscopies made a tremendous difference in our approach to revision surgery, because we're less fearful of going back in the abdomen. Certainly there was a time during the open surgery era where we really strenuously avoided going back and reoperating. So that's one thing. So we do also have this phenomenon that obesity and its treatment is not an emergency, and that does compel us to behave in certain ways when we treat this disease. But I think particularly in the US, we're seeing more and more about the failure of our primary care system to actually deal with the problem of obesity in a logical and successful way. I think this is partly based on the fact that there are few successful treatments available, but also on this issue of provider bias against obese patients. And I think this is something we all have to pay attention to. It's often considered a chronic personal failing, not a disease, and it's clearly the last socially acceptable form of punishment. But let's think about this for a moment from the patient's point of view. When you see a patient who's interested in having a primary bariatric operation and they come to you for consultation, what we typically all tell the patients is, you know, you've tried hard to do this with behavior. You've done your dieting efforts, you've done your exercise efforts, you've tried to lead a healthier lifestyle, and you've not conquered this disease. So we say to the patients, really, you can't do this without surgery. And we appreciate and admire your courage in coming in to look at having an operation. Now, unfortunately, what's the first thing we all tend to do when the patient comes back 5 years later with weight regain? we immediately start criticizing their behavior. And that is illogical. We've told the patient, we've given them the message that this is not a disease that's well treated by behavioral management, and then we turn around and blame their behaviors, and we become just like every other doctor, every other family member who's criticized them over the course of their lives. So now, evidence supports that our surgeries are life-saving, but we often act as though they're not. We often act, frankly, like we're elective cosmetic surgeons. We have this phenomenon where many of us refuse to see other surgeons' patients. We don't want to cover the emergency room for bariatric surgery complications. So a patient who has had, say, a vascular surgery operation can go to any hospital and see any vascular surgeon and will receive care. And yet in bariatric surgery, we act like, hey, I didn't do that operation. I have no obligation to provide care for that patient except under true emergency circumstances. I think we have to reevaluate how we practice and recognize that the world is looking at us and watching our behavior to see if we're going to really act like true specialists who offer something special. So here's the genetics that I want to touch on, and this is going to get to my final point, and I appreciate your patience while I go through all this. This is Dr. Faruqi, who gave the keynote at the Obesity Week meeting a couple of years ago. Dr. Faruqi is a genetic researcher from England, and she's doing really fascinating work on the melanocortin leptin axis and the regulation of human food intake. And this is a busy slide, but basically what it comes down to is there are genetically determined pathways that influence your food choices. Now let's back up for a minute and think about what that means. So when I observe a patient eating inappropriately, instead of judging the patient as making a voluntary decision, what happens if this is really a genetic phenomenon? What happens if it's the wiring in the brain that makes them choose what they choose to eat? I think it helps us reinvent how we think about patients. Remember, we observe the external, outside of patients when we observe their behavior. We don't often know enough about the internal dynamics to understand the motivations for that behavior. So here's my very simplistic analogy in this situation. So if we see somebody, this poor girl here with stringy, oily looking hair, what do we assume? What do we assume about this person? Do we assume that they don't shower and they don't wash, that they maybe they don't bathe regularly? We might assume that they're even lazy and low intelligence people because, gee, they look like this. So there's actually diseases that cause this problem, but how many times do we see someone who has a socially unacceptable phenomenon that we can see and we say, oh, they must have a disease? Well, the challenge for us is to think about our patients in that way, to constantly be reminding ourselves that these folks have a disease. So what if now your food choice is actually influenced by these neural pathways which are genetically predetermined? So we all recognize the phenotype of an obese person. We know an obese person when we see one, just like obesity is like pornography. It's hard to describe, but we all know it when we see it. Well, now let's observe obesity. So just for a moment, look at this picture of this individual and then ask yourselves, are you judging this person? You don't know anything about their situation. You don't know anything about their internal dynamics. You don't know anything about their neural genetic pathways and their melanocortin 4 receptor. What you do is you see an obese person, obviously, because that's not subtle, and you observe the eating behavior, and we make judgments. And it's a challenge for us every day in this specialty to take those judgments out of what we do. So in summary, the evidence clearly suggests that what we do in bariatric surgery is life-saving. It decreases mortality long-term, it improves and cures comorbidity, and actually even decreases healthcare costs. And now, in this new world of bariatric revision, we're getting an opportunity to re-examine some of the basic concepts that we have thought we believed for decades and readdress them and see if they actually seem true anymore. So I think we're learning quite a bit from the study of suboptimal outcomes and looking at these core issues that impact our specialty because we're dealing with the science of failure. And we should ultimately do better when we figure out ways to minimize failure and struggling. So issues related to the primary procedure, both selection and how the procedures are done technically for the long haul. The chronic disease model emphasized by this focus on revision. Even how we judge our patients and their behavior. Do you judge someone when they come back with weight regain after surgery, or do you evaluate them and then try to guide them towards better treatment or treatment that can be successful? And then, we have to really confront and develop a further and deeper understanding of this disease in order to do better in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.